Department of Child Health, Universitas Indonesia, Faculty of Medicine. I will moderate this afternoon lecture. We would like to express our gratitude toward our respected guest, Professor Stephen Graham of University of Melbourne, Australia, for his willingness to share his valuable knowledge with us today. We also would like to thank participants who have joined us in this event this afternoon. Before we begin, let us hear opening speech from the head of Department of Child Health, Universitas Indonesia, Cipto Mangunkusumo Hospital, Dr. Fatima Safira Alatas, PhD, consultant of pediatrics. Thank you, Dr. Fatima, for your opening speech. Now, please, Dr. Fatima, to open this lecture.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Darmawan. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang. Salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Semoga kita dalam keadaan sehat. Alhamdulillah, seperti biasanya, tim PKW yang sangat aktif ini mengadakan continuing education dalam bentuk apapun, terutama bila kita sedang kedatangan profesor dari luar negeri. Jadi pada hari ini, alhamdulillah kita kedatangan profesor, yaitu salah satu gurunya dari Dr. Nina di Australia, yaitu Profesor Stephen Graham tentang air pollution and child health. Jadi saat ini memang kita sedang menghadapi polusi yang cukup berat di Jakarta. Banyak sekali anak-anak kita yang terkena batuk pilek dan mungkin sampai pneumonia. Urusannya Dr. Darmawan nih makin berat, dengan tingginya mungkin kendaraan-kendaraan bermotor yang seperti sampai membuat traffic di Jakarta tuh sangat berat ya. Juga di kota besar di Indonesia. Nah, kelihatannya juga di luar negeri seperti itu. Sampai kita harus membuat WFH kembali pada anak-anak didik juga di pemerintah ya, dan juga ASN diminta untuk WFH untuk menurunkan air pollution ini. Jadi kelihatannya bukan hanya infeksi yang biasanya saja, tapi juga karena kita sendiri yang membuat infeksi tersebut terjadi. Nah, hari ini akan mendengarkan lecture tentang hal ini, semoga bermanfaat untuk kita semua. So thank you, Professor Stephen Graham. We meet again. Before we already met here to talk about tuberculosis, now about air pollution. In Indonesia, especially Jakarta, air pollution is increasing, I think, and many respiratory diseases come up in our outpatient clinics, even more than the immunization patients that came lately. So I think air pollution is maybe not only in Jakarta, but all in other countries, especially big cities, that air pollution is one of the health problems nowadays. I hope that the government can solve this problem also, because I think this is not only for the healthcare or health professionals that can deal with this, but also should be by the help of the government to solve this problem. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. It's a pleasure for us to have you here in Jakarta to talk for our pediatrician and some of our residents, and also maybe some of the general practitioners who is in the first line of the healthcare in Indonesia. At the moment, our morbidities and mortalities of the under 5 is still high. So we are trying to solve the problem. One of pneumonia is one of the main problem in our country, besides diarrhea. So now, because of the air pollution, maybe pneumonia is the highest one. If we cannot find solutions for this problem. So I hope you enjoy your lecture today. Thank you again for your time to share your knowledge. On behalf of our department, thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Dr. Safira, for your opening speech. Now I will introduce Prof. Steve Graham. I think we don't need to read all the CV of Prof. Steve. I just make it short. Prof. Steve Graham is an international child health professor from International Child Health from University of Melbourne. He is the expert of tuberculosis. He is a well-known expert in this field, and he has a lot of collaboration in Indonesia and other countries in Asia Pacific and also in Africa. That's the short introduction of Prof. Steve. Prof. Steve, as you already know, that air pollution now becoming a trend, a hot topic, especially in Indonesia and foremost, especially in Jakarta. Since some people take this as a new issue. Actually, this is not an old one, since the air pollution already lasting years. Yeah, and in Indonesia, in Jakarta, people say that some cases of the respiratory problem increasing. Now we would like to hear from you, what is this air pollution? What is the damaging effect of this pollution? And how we recognize and identify the problem causing by this pollution. Now I will let you give your lecture. Prof. Steve, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Damoan and Dr. Fatima, for the very warm welcome. It's good to see you again. I was here just last year in November, I think it was, and it's a great pleasure to be back to talk to a topic that I'm not quite as probably familiar with as I am with tuberculosis, but certainly, as you say, it's a very, very common problem, and it's an increasing problem, as Dr. Fatima says, I think, particularly in urban environments. And I think I could just say that while this talk will probably be talking more than just child health, and I think it's an area where I think we probably still need more evidence. I think we all understand the challenges. I think the challenges with air pollution are real, but let me just talk to some of the evidence that we have. I wanted to thank a number of people for helping me put together this presentation. One of them I'll acknowledge at the end is Professor Guy Marks. He's a thoracic physician from Australia who is the president of the International Union Against Tuberculosis and Lung Disease, and he's had a long-standing research interest in the impact of air pollution on lung health. And also Professor Kim Mulholland, who's a colleague in Melbourne, who's been doing work particularly in Mongolia, where in the capital city there's a major problem with air pollution and impact on health. So we do know that there are many airborne threats to health. And I think we're particularly familiar with the most recent reminder from the COVID pandemic, that there are many airborne threats to health that are infectious diseases. But there's also the challenge we have with fossil fuel or biomass combustions most of it generated from the activities of mankind with cooking, heating, transport, industry, etc. We've known for a long time the problems of silicosis or coal workers in Australia. Recently, there's been attention to silicosis amongst people who work as stonemasons, causing very damaging lungs. There's issues of asbestosis, and I was with a friend just this week who has mesothelioma, a problem from exposure to asbestos. But in Australia recently, we've had big problems with bushfires and agricultural burning, and an epidemic of asthma in the context of thunderstorms. So I think there's a whole variety of issues that can cause problems to lung health. Now, if we go back, as Dr. Fatima suggested, air pollution has been around now for a very long time, really since the Industrial Revolution. And this is a photo from England in the 19th century. And it was at a time when there was also a lot of poverty. There was a lot of nutritional deficiency. Rickets, for example, used to be very common. Child mortality was high. Chronic respiratory disease was common. We didn't know much about cancer at that point. How much of this was related to the poor conditions due to air pollution and how much was related just to poverty and socioeconomic issues is probably not known, but it was certainly recognised that as well back a long time ago that air pollution was going to have an impact on human health. And now you can see that the global map here is that perhaps like so many of our health challenges, they've moved from the industrialized countries to perhaps more commonly now a problem in lower and middle income countries that may not have the resources to be able to adjust and adapt and to actually reduce air pollution. So we talk about population above air quality guidelines in terms of particulate matter. What's important, I think, is particulate matter that is small, particularly less than 2.5 microns, is one measure of particulate matter. That's like about 30 times less than the diameter of human hair. So it's very, very small. And you can see where this is a common problem now in terms of air quality. As I said, the epidemiology has probably changed over time. And in terms of major risks for global burden of disease, this analysis was done, published in the Lancet some time ago, more than 10 years ago now. And you can see the main issues are household air pollution from solid fuels, so cooking, heating inside the house, with common conditions being cardiovascular, respiratory, and also ambient particulate matter, also contributing to often not just respiratory disease, but often cardiovascular disease and malignancy. So these are important associations for global burden of disease. And we now know that there's been analysis on the mortality, and you can see that outdoor fine particulate matter pollution is a leading risk factor for death globally. These are the estimates that it contributes to more than 4 million deaths globally and over 100 million disability-adjusted life years lost. Plus, there's another additional almost 4 million deaths due to indoor air pollution. And that, again, is now a major problem in the more low and middle-income countries, not well serviced necessarily by indoor heating, indoor cooking with clean energy. And it causes a whole range of damage to the human health, which I'll just run through quickly. And what's important, I think, is the growing inequity in the impact, which I've already highlighted. So this was a review done, which I just really throw up to just as a background reference, a very careful review of some of the impact of air pollution on non-communicable disease. And you can see on the left that many of the body's organs, there is evidence to suggest associations. it's not always easy to prove that air pollution is the direct cause of something, because there's often so many confounders, but there's certainly been associations with a whole range of organ dysfunction. And different particulate matter depends on the pollutant, is likely to cause damage to different tissues. So, for example, there you can see the difference, as you might expect, between what large particles might do to mucous membranes versus small particles getting into the smaller airways, or that other gases like nitrogen dioxide or carbon monoxide cause different problems. So the type of pollutant matters, and in terms of the damage, and obviously the density of that pollution also matters. Okay, so one study that looked at the impact of ambient air pollution over natural cause mortality was a study undertaken called the ESCAPE project in Europe. And that project has involved 13 countries, 22 cohorts, and a large number of participants, followed over a very long period of time, over which period of time there was obviously a large number of deaths in those populations recorded. And in terms of impact on mortality, natural cause mortality, there was overall an impact of ambient particulate matter 2.5. So it had a significant effect on mortality. And sorry, I've got this thing that's on the middle of my screen and I can't get rid of it. I'm sorry. And so it just keeps coming up. Everybody who's being admitted coming in is being put up onto my screen. Sorry. So there's significant impact. I'll get rid of this. Yeah, it's gone again. Yeah. So the impact on mortality overall was that there was a higher impact of mortality due to long-term exposure to air pollution, as you can see, overall. Perhaps not to the extent that you might have anticipated. And in terms of the types of morbidities and mortalities, the pollutants associated with often were with cardiovascular disease, such as acute coronary syndrome, and clearly with lung cancer, as is probably not a surprise, and in some with pneumonia in the first year of life, and then obviously lung function in primary school-aged children and lung function in adults. So my slides have gone now. It's been disabled. Participant sharing has been disabled. So I'm not sure where this is going. Yeah. All right. I'm sorry, we just have to wait until I get the screen up again. I will say that while I'm waiting for that, we don't have as much clear evidence about the impact of air pollution on child pneumonia, perhaps, as I think we often assume, and on respiratory diseases. So, okay, so that's just to show, as no surprise, also the impact on low birth weight. So these are some of the things that are starting to become consistent: cardiovascular, cancer, respiratory function, and also antenatal effects as well. And all of these clearly are major issues. Can't move it now. No. Yeah. So this is just some diagrammatic examples to show that air pollution has an effect from as early as being in the womb as a fetus, so exposure to the pregnant woman, already is starting to have impact in terms of low birth weight, premature and stillbirths, in terms of organ damage, such as when a mother is cigarette smoking, for example. Then you move to the baby, the impact on the child, and there's harms at every point along the spectrum of age. These are highlighted again. The impact on the fetus and on the baby. Sorry, I've been distracted now. I'm not. And the effects can be even at relatively low levels of exposure. And obviously any impact on health early in life, such as respiratory disease in children, and we're starting to understand this more and more, whether it's post-pneumonia, post-TB, chronic asthma as a child, a lot of these have lasting impacts on your health problems in terms of lung function, for example, and early mortality. And these are now being understood better. So long-term effects. So anyway, I think I'll just keep moving on. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight as well the problem of reduced cognitive development as well in neurodevelopment. So I'm just trying to emphasize some of the effects are very, very wide-ranging and have consequences for the rest of life. Okay. So in terms of when these effects happen, and in terms of relation to exposure, the risk obviously increases with the degree of exposure, but for some of the issues, the risk rises quickly, such as for stroke or for ischemic heart disease, and then it gets to a certain level and then it flattens out. So once you get up to annual particulate matter exposure, micrograms per cubic meter of up around 100 over 100 for stroke and ischemic heart disease, as you further increase, it doesn't really make much difference. Whereas for other conditions, it's much more related to a dose effect, including for chronic obstructive airways disease, for lung cancer, and also for acute lower respiratory tract infections. So the reduction in the relative risk of disease depends a bit where you are on the exposure response curve. I also just wanted to highlight that, for example, in Indonesia, and this is data from last year's Global TB report, we know that there's a particular high age-related prevalence amongst adult males in Indonesia, and one of the major risks for that is cigarette smoking. So in terms of mitigating this, these are photos from Ulaanbaatar, the capital of Mongolia on the left, and from Hanoi in Vietnam on the right. This requires governments to be involved in order to reduce exposure to air pollutants. This is something that's not really directly in the hands of us healthcare providers. So this is an important challenge, and we require evidence. And we need to know where is the air pollution occurring. We need to know what are the major sources of the air pollution, and then we need to be able to do health risks assessments, and we need then to develop policies to reduce the main sources of air pollution. So it's quite complicated and it's quite challenging, and it does require evidence, often generated locally or nationally, to influence policymakers, because it often requires a lot of reform. It's quite hard to get strong evidence from human experiments. Exposing people to health pollution and measuring their effects would be the best way to do that, but that puts them at serious risk, and people can only be tested with very short-term exposures, and you usually have to do that in healthy young subjects who don't have comorbidity, so they may not be representative. So it's very hard to get a real-world representation by experimenting on humans, the direct effects of particular pollution. There can be observational studies or randomized crossover studies, as in this case, where people, adults with asthma, who are known to be asthmatics, some were asked to walk around Hyde Park, which is a clean area of London, and others on Oxford Street, which is a very busy street. And you can see that there was a big difference in terms of the FEV1, or the forced expiratory function in those asthmatics, depending on which part of London they happened to be walking around. And then you can do observational studies over time and in space, but there's major problems with, as I've said a few times now, with potential confounding factors. Often the people most exposed to the air pollution also may have other socioeconomic or nutritional factors or various other risk behaviours, etc. So there's always this problem of having to adjust for confounders in doing studies. But there are ways of measuring air pollution, and sometimes it requires monitoring in different sites, for example, in the city, and using data that's available, traffic data, meteorology, weather patterns, etc. All of these can be used to provide evidence of the changes in air pollution over time and in certain settings within a country or even within a city. And it's important then to be able to identify what are the major emitters of air pollution in your particular context. And there's a whole range, depending on whether you're urban-based or rural-based, as to what your exposures actually might be. So it's not straightforward research to be able to gather the evidence that's required. This is just an example. On the right, you can see a monitor for recording particulate matter up in the top right corner, which was set up at the Woolcock Institute in Sydney during a period when there was major bushfires in Australia. And that's what Sydney looked like at the time of the bushfires. And you can see that that was heavily polluted. And what they did then was to look at what actually happened in terms of exposure to the smoke in Sydney over time during that bushfire, and they were able to measure that. And you can see during particular times how much higher it got than what was considered to be a WHO or an Australian standard guideline. So it frequently, over a period of a couple of months, went up over and above what is recommended as a safe level. And then they were able to just correlate that with excess deaths that occurred during a period of time. And these were the results. And you can see particularly that there was excess deaths, that there was, and you can see the confidence intervals there for the estimated numbers of cases. There was increased cardiovascular hospital admissions, there was increased respiratory admissions, and there was increased emergency department attendances for asthma. And this is data, as I said, from Guy Marks and others in Australia during the bushfires. Another problem we've had in Australia is thunderstorm asthma, where people have suddenly developed very, very severe asthma requiring hospitalisation and in some cases death. And this is due to the release during thunderstorms of upflow of pollen generated by the thunderstorm and explosion of the pollen into much smaller particulate matter. So this is perhaps a more biological, natural occurring particulate matter that can set off very, very severe asthma in asthmatics during a thunderstorm. So we have to be able to formulate a plan, and we have to be able to have acceptable and feasible policy options. And I guess we need to have that background data, that understanding of what is the epidemiology. And as I said, that's quite complex. And then to be able to show that any intervention to be effective. And this requires a lot of stakeholders being involved, certainly more than just us involved in healthcare provision and in the healthcare sector. There's major implications in changing this. It's really, really important, but it requires a whole range of skills and a whole range of stakeholders to be able to make the changes. And it certainly requires political will, and that's a massive challenge in many settings. So the air pollution effect on vulnerable populations is increasing, and it's not just obviously air pollution that makes these populations vulnerable, but I think it adds to the vulnerability of what is already there. And clearly, again, the level of exposure is important, and there is increasing inequity. The poorer people often tend to have to live in the more polluted settings. This is an example from South Africa. This is one near a coal plant which generates electricity for South Africa. There was an area called the Witbank, which was labelled as the world's dirtiest air, and you can see the annual mean on the right there in that colour map, how dense the pollution is close to the coal-fired power station, and then how it diminishes with distance. But in South Africa, there's a lot of poverty. In the post-apartheid times, people move into these very poor settlements that may be close to situations like this, or
Prof. Steve is freeze in my Zoom. Hello, the committee. Prof. Steve is freezing. Yeah, it seems a problem in the signal of the Prof. Steve. While waiting, Prof. Steve, from the committee, is there any explanation why the Prof. Steve is stopped? Okay, while waiting, Prof. Steve, this air pollution, as I said before, this is not a new issue. It's very old issues. Thankfully that recently the government gave special attention about this problem. But the problem that we, the health officers, do is we do it to solve the problem in the downstream, the hilir, yeah. The real problems laid in the upstream, the hulu, the production of the pollution. It can be from household, from the traffic, from the coal plants, PLTU, pembangkit listrik tenaga uap, with the coal, batu bara, bahan bakar batu bara that is causing the production of the pollutant. And we as the health system, health officer, only solving the impact of the pollution. It seems that the problem is still persists. While waiting, perhaps we can fill this time with a question. Is there any participant want to ask question? And then I will forward it to Prof. Steve later. Any questions from the audience? I got the data. Dr. Ricky want to ask something? You're still good? Oh, no. Okay, perhaps the other participant, Dr. Reza. Usually you ask question in every seminar. When you ask something about these issues, oh, can unmute. The committee, can you make the participant unmute by themselves, or when somebody raise the hand if you want to talk about this topic? Hello, panitia PKB, ada yang mendengar suara saya?
Dok, sebentar dok.
Thank you. I won't be long now. I'm sorry about this interruption. Yeah, I need to just work my way down to where I was. It's okay. Just to finish quickly. Yeah, I was just at the point where I was discussing, I'm not sure where I cut out, but I was discussing how we're starting to get evidence now of air pollution consequences from more, as the epidemiology changes, from some of the more resource limited settings where people have to live in very crowded conditions and very difficult conditions and require household cooking and heating, etc., with exposure. And you can see in this particular study, a birth cohort study, that there was a large number of episodes of lower respiratory tract infection, but also that antenatal exposures were the predominant risk factor associated with lower respiratory tract infection or wheezing illness. And so this is also some work from Mongolia. Now, one of the challenges in Mongolia is that climate change is leading to rapid urbanization, because with climate being less predictable, people from the rural areas are not able to secure agricultural occupations, and they're moving, younger people are moving very much to, and they build gers, which is their traditional house, a one-roomed house with a lot of indoor air pollution. And this pollution or cooking and heating, and this adds to the pollution in the particular city. And the majority of the actual capital's population live in what's called ger districts. And in winter, it can become very cold in Mongolia. I've been there when it's minus 30 degrees. So there's a period of time for a few months when everybody's really spending most of their time inside, and the air gets trapped, and the city becomes very, very polluted. And you can see that it's rated as one of the most polluted capitals in the world, that the pollution changes very much with season, particularly high in the winter, which is between November and March. And this is associated with a death rate. And this is the sort of, just to give an idea compared to other cities. For Mongolia, particularly in the ger districts, extremely high particulate matter per cubic meter. And even in the summer, it's in the city areas, the CBD, it's still higher than most other cities. And pneumonia is a major problem. So this is some research that's being done, including with our group in Melbourne, with Professor Kim Mulholland and colleagues in Mongolia, looking at the impact of air pollution on pneumonia hospital admissions, which is really a common problem in that part of the world. But so what has been noted with pneumonia, it's a bit challenging because there are other factors associated with child pneumonia, including during the winter. crowding and many other issues, it's a little bit challenging. But one thing that shouldn't change is the risk of, over time, is risk of spontaneous abortion, and that has been associated with air pollution in Mongolia. And then when they've introduced air cleaners for exposure for women during pregnancy in places where, in houses where they are, so that they can have cleaner air during antenatal period, that actually lowers their indoor exposure to particulate matter. These air cleaners are most effective in winter. Then there is the introduction of these air cleaners is associated with an increase in birth weight, and it's also associated with a decreased risk of spontaneous abortion. So there are a number of implementation projects going on in Mongolia, including a clean air project and the introduction of clean stoves. You can see in the photo on the right in Gare districts. And there's been the banning of use of poor quality coal and the provision of free electricity to the Gare district. And I was in Mongolia just last year, and certainly the pollution is much reduced compared to previously. This is what the estimated disease burden for Mongolia is in terms of business as usual, BAU, as it increases over time, is the red bar. And then if there was a moderately accelerated reduction in air pollution, this would be the improvement in terms of annual disability adjusted life years and mortality, in fact. And the best way would be to transition to clean fuels, and this would dramatically reduce the impact on health of in a setting like Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. In terms of child pneumonia, there is some evidence to suggest that introducing clean stoves inside a house to reduce exposure for the children to indoor air pollution reduces severe pneumonia. This is one study that showed that effect in Guatemala, in the highlands of Guatemala, which can get quite cold and where there's a lot of exposure to indoor cooking. And the introduction of clean stoves did reduce severe pneumonia. There has been a similar study in Malawi, and that did not show such an impact. So there has been variable data as it comes to reducing child pneumonia. But it's pretty hard to understand that there won't be an impact. There's one study that measured the amount of particulate matter that a child is exposed to. A child in Nepal, in the highlands of the Himalayas, just over the course of one day, when they measured the impact, the mother cooking over the stove with the baby on her back, the amount of particulate matter that baby was exposed to was the equivalent of the baby smoking 2 packets of cigarettes. So I think it's pretty hard to think that that's not going to have an impact on lung health. So finally, and I'm sorry about the interruption, the union is very much involved in the International Union Against TB, is very much involved in the push for safe air. We need to talk more about safe air. We know from a long time ago that once we got safe water, we could reduce the impact of diseases, gastrointestinal diseases such as cholera. This is the example from London with John Snow's observations back in the 19th century. And we now need to be able to do something similar in terms of showing the impact of safe air on respiratory health. And the big opportunities really are to get safer air to breathe for ending TB. We cannot stop talking about TB, or at least some of us can't. And effective, safe and accessible treatments for asthma are all activities in which the union is very much involved in terms of improving lung health. So air pollution is a major threat to life and well-being, and I think it has shifted from early industrialized countries to more and more resource-poor settings, especially urban setting. That's getting worse in most countries, and mitigating the problem requires evidence-based policy. But we don't need evidence about the health effects, and we don't need evidence about the contribution to climate change that air pollution is causing. And what we need is evidence about effective strategies for abatement. So I'll leave it there and say thank you and apologies for the interruptions.
Thank you, Prof. Steve, for your enlightened lecture. It widened our view about this problem. We have still about 10 minutes for discussion. Would you answer the question of the participant?
Of course, I can answer the participants. I will need to go to another meeting at 2. So, but yes, I think we have a few minutes, so that's great. Thank you.
Yes, it seems that the question mostly about the practical action, what to do in this pollutant environment. The question from Dr. Joko Mulyanto: do you recommend it for work from home or online learning due to this pollution problem?
Certainly, there must be ways we can reduce traffic congestion, and clearly having a flexibility to work from home when it's possible. I wouldn't recommend myself working from home every day, but I think that certainly that flexibility is something that COVID has taught us. I think the observation may have been in Jakarta during COVID that air pollution was reduced, partly due to traffic being reduced. So I think that's certainly one step. But I think at the end of the day, what's also happened in many countries is strengthening public transport, other methods of mobility. I ride a bicycle to work every day. I don't drive a car. I know that's not quite so possible here in Jakarta, etc. But there must be lots of imaginative ways in which we can reduce traffic congestion. That would be a great start. Yeah, and that would also reduce the carbon emissions.
So the control of the transportation, yeah, Prof. Yeah. And this is the next question. Is represent the worriness of the parents. Is it necessary for children to use masks again in heavy polluted area?
I think I'm not sure that we have a lot of evidence about the use of masks. I know that masks have been used widely, particularly in Asian cities, for a very long time before COVID. But I'm not sure, and my expert friend, Professor Guy Marks, agrees that we're not really sure yet how good masks are at protecting from the impact of very small particulate matter and pollution. So that's a challenge, certainly for large particulate matter, but for small particulate matter, which does a lot of the damage to the small airways and cardiovascular system, I'm not sure we have strong evidence, but that's where we maybe need to do some more human experiments. Yeah.
Oh, but about the mask, yeah. And the next question from Dr. Ricky: is there any specific recommendation about school activity in heavy polluted city? Is there a air quality index limit when we should close or open the school? And second question, do you have a recommendation about utility and efficacy of air purifier?
Yeah.
The limit and the air purifier.
Yeah, I mean, I think air purifiers are certainly getting attention now in the COVID scenario. And I would have thought that ventilation is always, of any indoor space, is always important. Air circulation is always important. But if you're just bringing in polluted air from outside to push through a room, then that probably is not really going to help. I don't know how air purifiers get rid of particulate matter from pollution. I understand how it works for infectious diseases droplets, but I'm not the expert on that. So I'm not really sure what the evidence is again for the use of air purifiers. I think it makes a lot more sense to look at the bigger picture and just reduce pollution altogether in the city. In terms of exercise for school children, certainly if a child's asthmatic, we tend to try and suggest that they don't do hard exercise when there's a lot of pollution. But again, this is one of those things that I'm not sure we have a lot of evidence. It just makes common sense But again, I'm not sure we have a lot of evidence either. Yeah.
In one of your slides, it is mentioned that the use of air purifier is give a good result for the pregnant mother.
Yeah,
It
that's true.
increased yeah.
Yeah.
So I think indoor it can be used, but not
Yeah.
for the outdoor
Yeah,
pollution.
no, I think that's very true. So you know that's true. That was for the pregnant mother. I'm not sure about how practical that is for all of us in a working environment, in a hospital, etc., to have these sorts of purifiers everywhere. But yeah, it seems to me we still have to worry about the air quality outside the building as well. Yeah.
Okay, the next question is from Dr. Maureen. It is a practical question. Prof, can we differentiate respiratory symptoms caused by pollution or by infection?
Great question. You know, I think most of us would not expect pollution necessarily to cause fever, and certainly perhaps not a lot of nasal congestion. It's more cough and red eyes, those sorts of things. But I think there's certainly a lot of overlap. So yeah, I think that's probably one of the challenges why we have in trying to measure the impact, because I think we often think that pollution may increase the risk of an infection causing severe disease rather than actually being the main cause of the presentation to hospital with respiratory illness. Yeah.
Okay, so it's not easy to differentiate the respiratory symptom is the same. The cough is the same, I think, yeah?
Yeah. Cough is a cough. So yeah.
The simple way, perhaps if there is fever, that means that is probably most probable this is from the infection, yeah?
Sure.
The next question is from Dr. Madeline. First question, different area in Jakarta pose different density severity for pollution. Is there any quick solution to help the residents to preserve their lung health? That's, oh yeah, it is the same. Does face mask and purifiers already asked?
Yeah.
The second question, if after being exposed to air pollution and suffer from its health effect, would it be reversible after exposure is omitted?
Would it be possible to what, sorry?
Would it be reversible after the exposure is omitted?
Yeah. I think we understand that you can have an acute response if it's a very polluted environment. We're moving away from that environment, you will have definitely reversibility. But the challenge is if you have exposure over a long period of time frequently, is that the damage that can do that will remain with you long term. So it becomes restrictive lung disease over a longer period of time. But certainly in terms of acute exposure, definitely reversibility, yes. I think any of us who have stood by a smoky fire realize you need to walk away to reduce the discomfort.
I think this you said in your slide that it can persist for life.
Yeah.
So perhaps it depends on the time of exposure and the duration of exposure, also the dose of exposure. Yeah.
Yes.
Exposure. Yeah.
In terms of the long-term effects, yes.
And the next question is related to TB. This is
TB, yeah.
TB is wait a moment. The question is like this. From Anya, pediatric residents. As aforementioned before, we have a surging amount of patients coming with chronic cough. As a result, these patients also experience weight loss. These symptoms are similar to tuberculosis because Indonesia is an endemic TB area. We examined them for TB, but in most of my patients, it turned out that it is negative. The finding for TB is negative. Is there any pointers where should know in order to reduce unnecessary examination in these patients? This
No,
is
I
the
think-
most popular disease in Indonesia, TB. Every children is suspected for TB.
Yeah. Well, I think that's important. I think in a TB endemic country, any child who presents with chronic cough and weight loss, they should be presumptive TB and they should be considered to maybe have TB. But as we know, majority will not actually have TB. It'll be another cause. But, you know, the links between chronic respiratory illness and air pollution are such that it's not one or the other. Air pollution increases the susceptibility to these infections. So you can have both at the same time. The evidence for TB tends to suggest that cigarette smoking is a much higher risk factor for TB than indoor air pollution exposure or even outdoor air pollution exposure. That's as far as I understand the evidence from adults. And there's quite a bit of evidence about that. So thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Steve.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I have to go because I have another
Yes,
meeting.
it's
But I'm
already
sorry.
2 o'clock p.m. So we have to close this meeting. Once again, thank you very much for your valuable times to give us lecture that widen our understanding about this problem. Thank you. And I hope we can meet again in the near future. Thank you, Prof. Steve.
Thanks very much, Prof. Damon. I appreciate it. Thanks to everyone for attending. Take care.
Terima kasih
Terima
kepada
kasih.
para peserta atas partisipasinya. Banyak pertanyaan yang diajukan, tapi karena terbatas waktu terpaksa kita akhiri. Thank you for Prof. Steve and all the participants. Till we meet again. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.